This section is number 5. It's about the Progressive Era. We're going to have one more section before the exam, and that'll be World War I. And I should be able to get that lecture online sometime in the next 24 hours. So this era is very complicated, but the fundamental ideas behind it are fairly straightforward. So number one, you've got a group of people that believe in reform. And that reform can take many different pathways. So you've got reform of the government, reform of business practices, reform of society, economics, reform of the relationship between the government and the people. There's lots of different people that believe that they're going to make forward progress in American society during this time. And the problem is that a lot of them have conflicting views, or you can't have one without the other. But basically, there's a couple of ideas that are the same no matter what you're really fighting for in terms of reform. And one would be the modernizing, well, number one, the belief that you can actually have reform. And number two would be a belief that the government can modernize. And in this process of modernization, they should harness human talent for the betterment of society, meaning there are certain people that have certain innate abilities to hold certain positions, and they should be put there so that they can do the best job possible. Number three, they kind of look at the idea of society as something that needs to be maintained. It's not just something that will continue to run itself without interference from humans, without interference from people that have a special knowledge of the environment or a special knowledge of economics or what have you. So there needs to be reform in order to actually keep society strong and to keep society healthy. And a lot of these progressives, most of them in fact, are extremely antitrust and anti-monopoly. And we'll talk a little bit more about monopoly in a little bit. A lot of your key figures here that are pushing for this reform are basically what we would call an investigative journalist today. Back in this time period, they called them muckrakers, and that started as kind of a negative term for them. As someone who kind of shovels in the muck looking for the most horrible, outright terrible story they can find. The closest thing you'd have today would be that reporter on the evening news who's always reporting some negative scandal or something like that. It's basically the same idea. You expose these things, and then through the controversy and through the scandal and through talking about it, you can make change. So one of the big figures here is a lady named Ida B. Tarbell. Is definitely a muckraker, no doubt about it. She's a writer, and she writes a book called The History of the Standard Oil Company. And in this book, she exposes a lot of business practices that are used by these huge corporations, which we've already talked about before, to gather all of this wealth to themselves. And she exposes all of these line by line, basically, and her work eventually leads to the breakup of Standard Oil Trust, the first kind of restructuring where they get rid of monopolies so that smaller businesses can compete. When you have a true monopoly, all of your smaller businesses are either getting gobbled up or they're being run out of business, and there's no competition. And this is viewed as something that's bad. Competition in the market is viewed as is always a good thing, and so you have to get rid of the monopolies to do so. Now, we're not just talking about journalism in the sense of someone who sits down and writes a paper or a book, but quite a few of the muckrakers were actually very skilled photographers. And up there would be one of these guys on that list would be Jacob Riis. And this is one of his photographs on the left-hand side, and he is specifically concerned more with the urban poor and going into these slums, especially in places like New York, where they've taken all of these tens of thousands, millions of immigrants, and they've jammed them into these sections of the city, and they're basically living in absolute squalor. And it's one thing to write about that, but it's another thing to take the the photographs and be able to actually demonstrate this to people. And he does write an influential book. It's called How the Other Half Lives, and it is basically it's a really heartbreaking record of what you could find in any one of the tenements in New York City. But he is trying to provide this record, this actual written record, so that someone has something to refer to when they're seeking out reforms. He's trying to expose these horrible conditions that these children are living in. Think back to that other lecture of the kids playing in the street right next to the dead horse. And I actually think that may have been one of his photographs. I'll have to look that up, but that's the kind of image that he's trying to put into people's minds to shock them into wanting to do something about what's actually happening in these cities. Another one of the more famous muckrakers is a man named Louis Hine, and he was a photographer as well, and he traveled all over the United States. He didn't just focus on the problems that are located inside of big cities. He looked at conditions in factories and mines, in small towns and farms, and one of his more famous photographs is over there on the left. It's just a little kid, and he's a coal miner. And a lot of the coal mines in certain parts of the United States would use kids because they can actually fit inside of the tiny little mine shafts a lot easier than full-grown men. But it's dangerous, dangerous work, and certainly no place for a kid. And that's the argument that the progressives are making, that children don't belong in these positions where they're being forced to work and everything else. A lot of Hine's work was done right here in Georgia, and traveled extensively throughout Georgia, and he intended to emphasize child labor when he was taking his photographs here in Georgia. Most of the medium-sized towns in Georgia at this time had at least one textile factory, and they would employ children because children have small hands. Small hands means it's easier for you to reach inside of the machinery to change bobbins and things like that. So you're right here at the turn of the century. You don't have any of the laws that you see in place today regarding what age you have to be when you work and forcing you to be in school and that kind of thing. And children are absolutely part of a system. They're part of this same system that the immigrants are part of, this kind of industrialized production system that we've been talking about for a couple of weeks. And here's another Hine photograph. This entire family is involved in textile production. So this is a basic way that people are able to feed themselves and stop themselves from starving, but it's also, think about the size of this family and the fact that they're every last one of them working in a factory. And I like this photograph because it tells a little bit of a story. If you look at the faces of the children, they're smiling. This isn't child labor in the kind of grotesque way that we would think about it today. Clearly, it's an interesting, pretty amazing thing that's happening, seeing this guy with his camera and getting to do something different in your day. So you have to be very conscious. The reason I show the photograph is you have to be very conscious of photographs in exactly the same way you have to be careful of written documents, where you have to be aware of what's actually going on in the photograph. You really can't use this photograph as your evidence to suggest that, oh, child labor wasn't as big a deal as everybody thought it was back in time, and using the cute little smiling girls to prove your point, because of the fact that you're not considering all the mitigating circumstances about what's actually going on and where they are and what having their picture taken actually means to them. So this goes along the same lines that I've already talked about several times of reading too much back in time. You also have to be able to read the photograph just like you read a primary document. There's also suggestions about reform especially in the meat packing industry, and this actually plays into a change in the role of the power of government. So this man here, Upton Sinclair, writes a book called The Jungle, and it's about meat packing and meat processing and the threats to public health and the danger to workers. And at this time, there's no government oversight in the production and packaging and shipping of food. So if you go to any any supermarket and you look back in the meat section, there'll be all manner of stickers telling you all kind of things about who's inspected what and what kind of packaging it's had and everything else. That's a direct result of this book. And what this book was a huge expose on the amount of filth and rat droppings and dead animals that are kind of caught up in this system. And because there's no restriction in cleaning it or keeping anything clean, they just continue to work in these conditions. And it's actually very, very abusive for the workers. And this book is extremely popular when it's first published. And the suggestion here is that the government should be able to do something to help protect the public health. And that's exactly what happens. There's the passage of the Federal Meat Inspection Act, and it means that the government can actually go in and look at these factories, and it requires everything to be labeled as to what is actually inside it. So is a package of meat half horse meat and it's supposed to be beef? Is it half pig and it's supposed to be something else? These things are going to be changed by this Meat Inspection Act. And Theodore Roosevelt is, who we've talked about before, is one of the chief figures in the progressive era politically. He's got a lot of power in this era, and he's one of the ones directly responsible for putting this Meat Inspection Act and then later the Pure Food and Drug Act into place. So much like your Meat Inspection Act, the Pure Food and Drug Act requires labeling. It requires that someone who's producing something list its exact ingredients. So you go to your pantry right now and you get anything out of there and you turn the package over, you're going to see a list of ingredients, all those names you can't pronounce and the quantities of things that are in there. This is exactly what that's all about. You've got lots of people that are just manufacturing any kind of crank, quack medicine they can think of, and then they're selling it as a pure elixir that will cure everything from erectile dysfunction to baldness. It's just like today, except there was no oversight into what these people were actually producing. That's where we actually get the term snake oil. Is there was a guy who was actually boiling snakes, or claimed he was boiling snakes, and then using that to make patent medicines. So after this, all of the garbage and just crazy stuff, even poisonous chemicals that are going into these things, there's oversight, and the government can begin to step in and start to help protect people. And the Pure Food and Drug Act leads to right into the modern day. We have the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, and they still work out all of these same issues with food and medicine that we're dealing with right on up to the very, very present. To get a new medicine approved, there's a lengthy process. You can spend 10, 15, 20 years trying to get a new medicine approved as it goes through this process of being checked out by the government. And it all really starts right here with the Food and Drug Act. Women are very, very involved in the progressive era, and they've got two major sources of reform that they're looking for. One has to do with liquor, and that is, it's called temperance, and this would be kind of an anti-liquor, get rid of the liquor and you solve all the problems of society. This is before Prohibition. Prohibition is a different thing. Now they're related and one of them eventually leads to the other one, but you have to make a very clear separation between the two. All right. The other one is, second one is voting, and we'll talk about that one in just a sec. So there are a lot of women in the United States that are convinced that the level of drunkenness and the easy availability of alcohol is contributing to all of the horrible things that are going wrong in these tenements and in these other places that everyone is so concerned about in this era. So you take immigrants, and then you expose them to all of this alcohol, and of course it leads to all kind of crime and the breakdown of families and everything else. And here's two posters that are just kind of basic, you could call them propaganda posters, whatever, that would have been carried on placards. And the idea is that if someone is drinking, they're not taking care of their children. They're not feeding they're feeding their kids. The money that was earmarked for food is going to booze. And if you're drunk, you're likely to engage in crime, and you're participating in the just slow sliding moral decay of American society. And so you can see how if someone wants to confront these issues, and of course starving children and crime and moral degradation, these are things you should be worried about as a citizen. If you're trying to solve these problems or make them less of an issue for people living in the United States, you can see how that is a progressive kind of viewpoint. You're trying to make those reforms to make society better, to kind of help with the maintenance of society. You can help the next generation, the children that are being born, if you can get a handle on the drunkenness and the crime and violence. There's another excellent poster that puts it in very graphic terms, the argument that the people in the temperance leagues are making. You see in the very bottom in the center is a woman with a child, and she's kind of upset, crying and holding her head. On the left is a guy, and he's just having a good time. He's going out to have a couple of drinks with his friends, no big deal. But then as time progresses and you go from left to right over this archway, the very last thing is him totally depressed and actually shooting himself in the head from his depression, committing suicide. So there's an extreme version of temperance, and that kind of extreme version is what you'll see come back to life with prohibition. But there's a clear connection between all of the horrors of what's going on in society and the slow destruction of families and things like that, and the availability of alcohol. And people are convinced, whatever your personal opinion on drinking is, they're convinced that this is a major social problem that has to be directly confronted. And one of the big figures, historically speaking, in the temperance leagues was a lady named Carrie Nation. And she hated the idea of alcohol's existence. She was by far on the extreme side of that argument. And she came up with a novel way of drawing attention to this problem. She would actually take her hatchet, which you can see indicated by the arrow to the left, and she would go into bars and use the hatchet to smash all the bottles and to smash the bar and break all the mirrors and chase out the customers and things like that. So now, of course, obviously she'd get arrested, but that gives her a chance to kind of make this statement when she's being handled by the police and when newspapers are interviewing her and things like that. So she always carried her Bible and she always carried her hatchet, and she absolutely had no fear of making these kind of really bold moves to kind of make her point. And some people absolutely loved her. They couldn't get enough of this, and in fact they would actually sell commemorative hatchets with her little name engraved on the handle, and every now and then at an antiques auction you'll see one of these Carrie Nation hatchets. But then of course on the flip side of that, she's absolutely vilified by the industries that produce liquor and the small business owners that are running these bars. In fact, one of them is on record as saying she's nothing more than a bulldog running around the feet of Jesus, and all she does is bark at the things that he doesn't like. So it's not a universal change in American society, but there's certainly people that are willing to put a very unique and an extremely, extremely aggressive step toward resolving these issues. And like I said earlier, the second major one in terms of women in the progressive area is suffrage. That's the right to vote. And you've got two major figures that are behind this. Especially in the earlier years, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and they're pushing very hard for the women's right to vote, and it's a very divisive political issue. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton refuse to publicly support some of these constitutional amendments that are going in to protect the civil rights of black people. And their argument for that is it's not a racial argument, it's that no one should be given preferential treatment under the law over anybody else. So if you're going to give a black man the right to vote, or you're going to codify in a written law a black man's citizenship, why can't you do the same thing for women? Why can't a black or a white woman vote where a white and a black man can? And so they're kind of loud making a very loud political argument as well. And they're able to muster lots and lots of people that actually go and picket, protest. There's lots of ways that they get attention to themselves as well. None of them with a hatchet, unfortunately, like Carrie Nation, but they're still doing their best to bring a lot of as much attention as possible to this issue. And it's really unfortunate that this proto-early women's rights movement is unable to share political power with some of the other civil rights movements that are going on at the same time. People pushing for more rights for formerly enslaved blacks, or voting rights, citizenship, getting rid of voting requirements in the South, defeating the Jim Crow laws, which we've talked about a little bit. And it actually, what it does is it puts the women's rights movement at odds with all of the other ones. And it's not until really in the 1960s, right into the 1970s even, that these groups come back together with a kind of unified purpose. And we'll talk about that when we get to it. But you can see some of the protesters here. And a lot of immigrant women were also involved in this, for a reason that we'll talk about in just a second. Now, of course, just like with temperance, you've got some detractors, and the detractors are portraying in written and visual form, and in little songs they would sing in bars and things like that too, about the women that are pushing for this right to vote, that they're all old ladies, that they're all lesbians, that they're all man haters. And you can see how they're drawn here in these pictures, that all have great big buck teeth and huge overbites, great big noses, and the cartoon calls them plain things. You can hear plain things, and you can see them too, meaning that they're not very attractive. And of course, this kind of cartoon is attacking them directly, based solely upon these cultural images of how women should look and act. And these are part of those reforms that the women are specifically targeting. So some of the features of their temperance argument would be any lips that touch liquor will never touch mine. You've got women that are saying they want a man that will support their right to vote before they'll get married, and things like that. So there's an interesting play, a little bit of back and forth here between gender as well as on the political side of things. But you can see this reform action slowly taking hold. Another figure that you definitely should be aware of, at the very least, is Margaret Sanger. And Margaret Sanger was a huge figure who had her specific thing was birth control. She was involved in other women's rights issues, but birth control, the excessive access of birth control, was definitely her key thing. And she argued that no woman can call herself free until she can choose consciously whether she will or will not be a mother. And she started her political career as a nurse, and so she saw these immigrant women that would come into hospitals with no money, no ability to take care of themselves, and with 6 kids. And so she saw there being this need for there to be access to birth control, because what they were doing was making this tenement situation a million times worse, because they were unwanted children. And you didn't have to look very hard to find examples of people that were selling their children to get food and everything else. It's a horrible situation. So she's trying to respond to this at a really, really fundamental level. Now, let me be very clear about Margaret Sanger. She is an extremely controversial figure. She says plenty of strange things about birth control and race, but these ideas really start to pick up speed in this time period. If you turn on the news today and listen for 15 or 20 minutes, you will hear some kind of a story about Planned Parenthood. And Planned Parenthood, it comes from has evolved from a social group that she founded around the turn of the century. So there's a real correlation between the things we're arguing about, fighting about politically now, and what happened back in the past. And we're going to see Margaret Sanger again a couple more times probably, so just keep her in the back of your mind. One of the ways that the government and kind of traditional society had to control discussion and dissemination of this material, specifically birth control, was through the use of obscenity laws. And there was what's called the Comstock laws after this man here, Anthony Comstock. And so if she, or anyone really, mailed literature about birth control through the mail, it could be classified as obscene material. And then the person who sent it could be arrested or fined, put in jail or prison, what have you. And it applied to literature about birth control. Depending on how things were worded, you could fall under the obscenity laws. So it's a kind of a crude tool for taking care of things that the government doesn't like. So as much push as you have toward reform, you also have an incredible pushback from traditional society at the same time. It's never, we kind of arbitrarily break up the chapters in the book and give them these names, like the progressives. It's not like everyone woke up, suddenly they were progressives, and society just kind of marched along. There's always been this conflict back and forth, like two tectonic plates scratching against each other in American history. There's very, very few times where you could argue that, oh, well, most of the United States is united behind some goal, or they all believe one way. And this entire era is a very good example of that conflict. There's a great increase in the number of political societies, and this is not just the kind of gender-based ones like we've been talking about. And these political societies are devoted to all manner of concerns. And there's some really big ones, though, of course. In 1909, the NAACP is founded, and the idea behind this organization is that it will help black people assert their civil rights. It will help them to deal with getting rid of the era of Jim Crow and pushing for recognition of civil rights and actually being able to put into action all of these laws about being able to vote and things like that. Because remember, at this time period we're talking about, this is the height of Jim Crow. There's a huge number of lynchings in the South, all over the United States, actually. Segregation is essentially a national policy, and so a group like this is going to be much more assertive. This man here, W.E.B. Du Bois, looks at the situation in the United States and says, this is no good. This is just not an acceptable situation for anyone to be living in, and we have to do something to kind of protect our rights and to advance these civil issues as much as possible. Clearly another example of someone who is reform-minded and is feeling the push of that progressive paradigm. And you have to consider the context. So W.E.B. Du Bois, he really wants to be assertive. He wants to use legislation, or he's discontent with the way things have been going. This is a fairly radical idea considering the time period we're talking about. You can contrast this with the previous ideas of Booker T. Washington. So Booker T. Washington, he says he wants the exact same things. All these civil rights recognized, all these issues with voting and socioeconomic station of black people in the United States, and he wants this dealt with. But Booker T. Washington is suggesting a very slow course, to avoid confrontation and to make this, even if it has to take several generations to achieve, that's fine, that it needs to be a gradual progression. And Du Bois doesn't have any time for that at all. This whole idea of slow change and working on personal advancement is just not going to cut it. He is ready for black people to be included in society as equals and rejects the idea of a long-term multi-generational process to do so. Of course, that idea is very radical at this time, and there's lots of people that are not ready for someone to be as aggressive. And a really good example of this, and what really kind of shows the limits, that there are limits to the scale of social change going on, is Du Bois is actually invited to the White House for dinner with the president to discuss some things. And because he is invited to the White House, it creates a scandal amongst the Washington elite. All these politicians in Washington see a black man going into the White House to meet with the president, and they lose their mind. And it becomes a major, major scandal early in the administration of Theodore Roosevelt. And I only mention this because of the size of the scandal, and just to show that it is working. There's a shift, a focus in looking at the social position of black people in the United States, because the progressives are willing to talk about it. They want to bring this in, and they clearly view this as an issue. And while politicians may be looking at this as just a basic progressive impulse, something that just should be done as part of the general reform movement, men like Du Bois are looking at this as in a more personal way. So lynching, as I've just mentioned, was kind of par for the course in huge parts of the United States, and lynching, violence, just racially inspired violence, is a way that a lot of these structures were maintained. So you didn't, even if you had a law that said something, someone couldn't exercise that law out of fear that there would be a violent retribution. And for decades, a flag was hung from the NAACP headquarters in New York City that said a man was lynched yesterday. And there's been different variations of this flag used in the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. And I think I've seen some versions of it on t-shirts on the nightly news recently too. But you can see that there's different levels of, I don't want to say attention, there's different levels of importance that this has to different reform groups. And we mentioned trust and monopoly. This is another one of the major areas of concern for progressives, and it's this wholesale concentration of wealth and money in a very small number of hands. I mean, I went through a list of the top 5 in just a couple of minutes in one of the previous lectures. And you've got two very, very progressive figures, Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt, and they have very different approaches to dealing with trusts. So even though you've got both of these powerful men that both become president, they both have a lot of political clout, they're still entirely different ways of looking. They have entirely different ways of looking at how do we deal with trusts. And Roosevelt's idea is what's called the new nationalism. And he wants to, under the new nationalism, he wants to use the power of government to regulate the control of trusts. And he believes it's the government's job to control these organizations with the power of the president, and that power of the president should be backed up by legislation. And it puts a lot of power in the executive branch. It means that the president himself has got a lot of power in terms of being able to either control or get close to one trust over another. It gives the president a lot of leeway in how to act. Conversely, you've got Wilson, whose plan is he called the New Freedom, and he had no time for trusts, and he believed that it was the answer was to use the power of government to just destroy trusts, that it was a bad thing from one end to the other. We've got another great political cartoon. Teddy Roosevelt was renowned as being a hunter. He would go on these hunting trips and shoot exotic animals, and so he's often portrayed in political cartoons as this kind of rough and tumble, woodsy hunter guy. And you can see here he's shot dead the bear that is labeled bad trust, but the trust that is labeled good trust is on a leash held in his hand. So Roosevelt would argue that good trusts do exist and should be allowed to exist. They just need to be on that real short leash of legislation under control of, their power being able to check by the government. So we can even look at progressivism in totally different terms, in terms of the environment. So prior to the progressive era, people have been harvesting and extracting resources out of the environment, particularly in the West, as fast as they could go. And one historian records that basically Americans were, quote, dazzled and intoxicated by the inexhaustible riches of the land. And when he says riches of the land, he doesn't mean gold and silver. Well, he does mean gold and silver, but he also means all the kind of raw materials, a lot of trees, water, arable land, that kind of thing. And people are concerned mostly in the beginning with how do you get this stuff out of the ground, or how do you process it, how do you extract the resource for consumption. But when you get along to the time period when the West is closed, like is suggested by Frederick Jackson Turner, people begin to see a net loss of environmental potential. And one of the ways you can track this is by looking at the size of the forests. So in just this short period of time, when the railroads are completed from east to west coast, more than 100 million acres of trees in the United States are cut down. And we're not talking about trees like we have on the east coast of the United States, where precious few trees are old growth. In fact, you got to get way up into the northern United States before you find real old growth trees. We're talking about trees that are, well, like this one here. This sequoia is 26, it's almost 27 feet in diameter. So we're talking about gigantic trees and gigantic forests. And all of this is being extracted, chopped up, and shipped east to production facilities just as fast as people can go. And the irony of the ability to produce iron rails and steam engines and trains is that it accelerates this process to a huge degree. So even though you're cutting down huge trees, they're still moving whole forest at a time on rails. So you've got two trains, then they contain one tree, and that's the one on the left and the right. Or left in the middle, sorry. The one on the right has got smaller sections of tree in it. But with the rail lines and the closing of the West, the destruction of the buffalo, moving all the Native Americans onto reservations, it's much easier to actually extract all the natural resources in terms of gold, silver, rare minerals, rare earth minerals, and things like trees. Here's another really good photograph to give you some kind of an image of scale. These guys are posing around this tree that they've cut down, and if you look where the arrow is, that is a team of horses on top of the tree. So they've actually been able to drive a team of horses up there to pose for the photograph. So this photograph always reminds me of some of those photographs. I'm sure you've seen hunters. They take a picture with whatever deer or elk or pig they've shot. It's kind of like a trophy picture. And this photograph almost reminds me of the same thing. Like these lumberjacks are kind of celebrating the conquest of nature and the ability to extract all these resources. And this resource extraction just goes unchecked from the time people get to these forests right up into the Progressive Era. Problem is, by the time we get to the Progressive Era, people are getting really frightened of how much of this stuff has been destroyed and used up. And so there's an actual progressive response to the degradation of the environment. So you've got two basic visions of what should happen in the natural world in terms of human interaction with it. You've got wise use conservation and you have preservationism. And wise use conservation is the pet idea of a man named Gifford Pinchot. Pinchot is the first person to really confront this issue of trying to manage these natural resources so that they're just not stripped and totally destroyed. He is actually trained in forest service and forest management in Germany. And he believes that forests should be set aside, not sacrificed, in his words, for the short-sighted greed of a few, but used for the sake of the whole country. And this is wise use. And he's applying progressive principles to forestry, kind of the idea that waste, just for sheer waste, is a mortal sin, and that these things should be managed for future prosperity, and that the price of future misery is our greed today. He doesn't believe that the beauty of natural resources, the forest and unspoiled land, has any value at all, completely irrelevant. The fact that it is habitat for animals is completely irrelevant. And the only thing that really matters to him is management of the resources for human prosperity. And all other concerns are secondary. Now, confronting that, you have a man, well, I'm just going to use John Muir. He's the ultimate voice for preservationism. He's the founder of the Sierra Club. He's a naturalist. He's a self-made mountain man, wild man. He would just literally take off for weeks at a time, hiking in the woods, and just live off the land. And he argued that the forest and all of these natural resources should be left alone for the purpose of personal enrichment. And he takes it as an article of faith, like something that doesn't really need to be explained, that forest and trees are monuments in and of themselves, that they possess moral and aesthetic value. So when I say aesthetic value, I'm sure everybody's had that moment where they've seen a sunrise, or they've seen the moon late at night, or they've been camping and they saw the morning mist over a lake, and you've thought to yourself internally, man, that's just really, really beautiful. Wow, I'm so glad I got to see this, and you'll never be able to see it again, because it's this unique experience that you've had seeing this part of nature. That's what he's talking about, the aesthetic value of nature. He is very concerned that if you destroy habitat and you just have open field, then the only animal that can be there is cattle and sheep to graze, and you lose all of the beautiful natural creatures and the natural life cycles. So for preservationists and men like John Muir, preserving the forest is literally a life or death issue. Not only in the sense of the environment itself, but also in what a human entering that forest can take out of it. He believes that nature has a kind of curative effect in that it heals and cheers the spirit and the body and the soul alike. So I used to be a park ranger, and one of the things we would tell people all the time is that because we've got hiking trails and things where you can go out in nature and just kind of relax and calm down and enjoy the quiet and the serenity and the sound of birds and things like that, that it's a relaxing experience, and that really we're healthcare providers. And that's exactly what John Muir is insinuating here, in different language, but that's the basic idea of his argument. And these two short quotes, one from Gifford Pinchot and one from John Muir, illustrates very clearly the kind of difference. Pinchot wants these materials to last, and he wants to manage them. He's not saying we're going to go in there and just clear cut the entire forest, but it's going to be managed for the greatest good of the greatest number of people for the longest time possible. It's going to be used. It is going to be harvested. It is going to be extracted, but it has to be managed so that it's not a quick process that leaves the next generation without anything. And John Muir, of course, is completely on the other side of that argument, and he makes the same argument that it's more a moral and spiritual question about the forest, that these are places we should preserve because of what it says about us as human beings, and what can we get in terms of this calming effect, or your own emotional response to being outside in nature. You know, what's very interesting about this debate between conservation and preservation is that Teddy Roosevelt, President Theodore Roosevelt, this major progressive figure, is himself friends, very good friends, with both Gifford Pinchot and John Muir. So on the left side, you see a photograph of him in the fancy suit with the top hat, and they're out on some yacht someplace, no doubt discussing matters of policy, what have you. And then on the right, you see the outdoorsman, the hunter Theodore Roosevelt, in the riding breeches and the tall boots with the wide hat, out there talking to John Muir, who's got a beard that's 4 feet long and just wants to walk around in the woods and experience nature in person all day long. So Pinchot is an advisor, a confidant, and he has a lot of political influence with Roosevelt, but at the same time, Roosevelt completely understands the argument that John Muir is making, because he's traveled all over. He's hunted these animals in all of these wild places. He's been in South America. He's been in Africa. He's been in all of these places where you can see just how beautiful nature is. He's experienced the same things. He's had the same kind of emotional experiences that John Muir has had himself. So he agrees with Muir. And he even goes wandering in the woods with Muir a couple of times. And he listens to Muir walk along in the forest talking about his philosophy of the value of nature. And John Muir kind of acts as his personal tour guide. And you can see the tug one way or the other that must have been going on in Theodore Roosevelt's heart over how to process, how to handle this issue of the environment. And this issue of what to do in the natural environment comes to a head in a place called Yosemite Valley. And this is a wide shot of Yosemite Valley. It is absolutely beautiful. Even for people who don't like camping and don't like the outdoors, I mean, I think we can all pretty much agree that this is kind of the gold standard of what a beautiful area should look like. And government involvement with the protection of areas of wild land started all the way back, actually during the Civil War. So speaking specifically of Yosemite, Abraham Lincoln signs what's called the Yosemite Grant in 1864, and it sets aside portions of this valley to be protected and preserved. So already in 1864, people are beginning to look at these things as more than just resources, little areas of resources that can be quickly and totally consumed. Now, I'm sure that in 1864, the United States government was looking at it as a potential source of rifle stocks and wheels for wagons and things like that. It would be hard not to have that thought in the back of your mind with the country at total war with itself. But still, there's a lot being said when the United States government steps in and puts language on a piece of paper saying we're going to protect this piece of land. The black cavalry troops and infantry troops that we've talked about several times already, they were actually some of the first United States, well, representatives of the United States to be sent to Yosemite, and they actually patrolled the park when the park was created, and they were literally the very first park rangers in the National Park Service was soldiers, chasing out ranchers and cattle people and getting rid of the sheep and everything that were slowly eroding the environment. And John Muir always said, thank God for the United States Army, because they're the ones that protected these beautiful and natural areas. So even before the issue of Yosemite Valley and this conflict between conservation and preservationism, the United States Army has spent a lot of the United States government through the United States Army has spent a lot of effort in preserving and protecting the land. I love this photograph. This is one of my all-time favorite photographs, historically speaking, and you can almost imagine what's going on here in this photograph. The men are smiling. They're very relaxed. It's not like they're standing there in unit formation to be inspected with rifles or things. Look at those two guys right in the very front, smiling, and they're just having a good time. And you can almost feel the effect that being out here in this wilderness and experiencing this beautiful country was having on these men. It's a great photograph. I really like this one. And wholesale growth and expansion, industrialization has some major downfalls, and one of them is experienced in San Francisco right around the turn of the century, and that is massive fires after earthquakes. And you've got a city that's exploded in size as people have come west to extract resources, to mine for gold, to ranch cattle, to run sheep, and they've got these cities that are vulnerable to action of the environment. And this is an actual photograph of San Francisco on fire, and you can see it's across the entire horizon. It's a big fire, and San Francisco didn't have at this time the infrastructure to deal with something of this, a catastrophe of this size. They just didn't have the necessary water or ability to stop the whole city from being burned to the ground. And San Francisco immediately starts looking around for a place that can hold enough water, or that they can tap into to get water if they need it, drinking water, and of course lots of water for fighting fires. And one of the places that they look to is Yosemite Valley. And Yosemite National Park is actually composed of a couple of different major valleys, and one of the valleys is called Hetch Hetchy Valley. And it is decided by folks in San Francisco and California that if they put a dam in that valley, they can create a reservoir that will hold enough water that they can pump it'll fill whatever water needs they have for a long, long time before they run into a problem of losing water again. And this sparks a major battle between the preservationists and the conservationists, because the conservationists, the wise use conservationists, are looking at this as the best use of land, because you're going to put a dam, and the valley's going to be flooded. It's going to be underwater, but you're going to be able to provide all of this infrastructure and water to all these people in San Francisco, and that's a good thing, because the people in San Francisco need it. It's part of moving society forward. It's actually a very progressive idea. Meanwhile, the preservationists are coming unglued, because you're going to have this beautiful valley with all of this wonderful, untouched, virtually untouched natural wilderness, and it's going to be destroyed. It'll be underwater. All the trees will be dead, and there'll be this big lake on top of it. So it sparks a huge conflict that draws in the president, that draws in Congress, and eventually a vote goes through, and San Francisco gets the rights to build the dam in the Hetch Hetchy Valley and create the reservoir. And they build a pipeline that's 175 miles long, and that's long enough to carry all of the water from Yosemite to San Francisco. So as far as modern pipelines go, it's not that far, but 175 miles then was quite a marvel of engineering. So this is what it looks like before and after. This photograph is taken from almost the exact same spot, but before, you can see there's a river that runs through the middle of the valley. That's how valleys are created, and all of the trees and everything is still intact. And then the after photograph, after the dam is put in and the reservoir is filled up, backed up behind it, you can see all of it's been destroyed. So both sides in this argument, the preservationists and the wise use conservationists, are not wrong. They both have very clear, reasonable, logical arguments. And this is just another instance, and there's dozens of examples of this throughout time, where this progressive impulse can be applied in a multitude of different ways. It's very interesting to think about how we, given our 21st sensibility views of nature and the value of the land and things like that, would respond to this same kind of instance today. Would we have built that dam? Would we not have built that dam? It's just an interesting thought. But you can see here in real black and white photographs how progressive ideology plays out in the environment at this time.